Hey, this is Hunter with Lone Star Woodworking, and in this video I buy some pretty cool wood, and just like me it's falling apart and needs to be put back together, and hopefully in the process of doing that I build a pretty cool looking table. Alright guys, so these two slices or cookies are olive wood from a company in Turkey called Olive Wood Supply. Super easy name to remember because their name is exactly what they do. And after I unpacked these and put some mineral spirits on them and put some really cool pictures out on Instagram saying, hey, if you're interested in a coffee table, hit me up. I've got these two pieces that I want to make one with. I got a ton of, hey, it's going to look really pretty. Hey, look forward to the finished product. Hey, those slabs of wood are really, really pretty. But nobody really nibbled on a commission, so they sat at the base of my workbench for a really, really long time. And what you saw me doing just a couple seconds ago is something I do just every once in a while. I pull out all my live edge slabs and I figure out what I'm going to do next. And what I ended up thinking is like, okay, well, if nobody's going to buy the olive wood and let me make something cool, I'm going to make something cool and hopefully someone will buy it. So that's what I'm doing here. Now, after I got everything put together, and this is pretty indicative of olive wood just kind of falls apart like this. I had to figure out which pieces went to which slab, and then I put them in alphanumeric order. So I put 1A, 1B, 1C, 2A, 2B, 2C, just so I could remember the order that they all go in. Now this is a 31 by 31 form, so I do have to cut it down just a little bit. And this is a pretty sketchy cut. I really, really recommend not doing this. If I had to do this again, I probably would have put some kind of cantilever mechanism with a 2x4 on there and clamped it down so that way my hand wasn't in danger of getting ripped off. Because if my hand had just canted that piece of wood just a little bit and that saw got a little bit of extra bite on it, this could have been a very different video. Now all I'm doing here is messing around with some of the offcuts and trying to fill in some of that space because it just felt like there was going to be way too much epoxy. And eventually I found something that I liked. Now because olive wood breaks into so many different pieces and these two slices are no different, I couldn't really put a clamp on all of these different pieces. So what I came up with was using CA glue and just kind of pressing it down onto the form until it grabbed, and this worked remarkably well. Now, while it's important to seal your slabs every single time you're working with epoxy, it's even more so whenever you're working with cookies and these liquid dyes. Because a cookie or a crosscut, if you look at it under a microscope, is nothing but end grain, and end grain is nothing but a bunch of microscopic straws. So while an ebonized piece of olive wood actually sounds pretty cool as I narrate this, I still wanted to maintain the contrast of that golden color of the olive wood to that jet black color of the epoxy. Now these slabs were pretty thick, about 2 3/4, and if you don't know, sometimes you have to do multiple pours with your epoxy because you run the risk of heating or overheating and flash curing if you don't. Now epoxy cures with heat. The thickness of it, the thicker the pour, the more heat it generates. So you either have to have some kind of intervention, like the Black Forest Wood Co. They have a water-cooled aluminum table that they pour their stuff on, so they can pour up to like 3, 4, 5 inches even and not risk overheating. I am at a 2-car garage and don't have nearly that fancy of equipment, so even though this epoxy boasts its ability to pour up to 4 inches, because I don't have any kind of cooling system, I actually had to pour it at, I think, no more than maybe 1 1/4 inches at a time. So after about 6 weeks or so of pours and just letting it all cure, it was time to pop it all out of the form, and this went just fine. It was a little bit more difficult because that tape really wanted to stick for some reason, but it still popped off and I'm still able to reuse that piece of melamine. From there, it was time to start flattening it out, and this actually ended up being kind of an issue because of the amount of epoxy in this. Once I was done, it made my wife's garden look like a winter wonderland, and she was really not happy about that. So even on pieces as small as this, I'm going to have to start taking them to Algoa Millworks, and I'm not really upset about that. It's a much more accurate flattening, but it's just an extra cost, and it's not even that much, but I just don't want to make the drive. So after I got it cut down to size, which I think I ended up cutting quite a bit off, I think I ended up cutting this thing down to about 28 by 28. It was time to start filling in all of these little micro imperfections, and this was initially going to be the bottom. And you saw that big void there, and there was actually another one right next to it, and I just really didn't want to address those, so I was just going to make this the top. But as I was sanding, I realized that this side had a lot more epoxy and a lot more voids in the wood that allowed epoxy to show through, and it just looked really imbalanced. So I decided to go ahead and start working this side as the bottom, and then eventually go back and address those two big voids. Now, I am not sponsored by anybody, and I do not sign up for any kind of affiliate link. So what I'm about to say is totally just biased opinion and serves really no other purpose other than just to let you know. That router is absolutely amazing. That was a full 1-inch cut on a 22-degree chamfering bit, and the dust collection system on that captured 99% of it. There was just a really, really small mess for me to clean up, but I probably could have left it and nothing would have changed. So if you are in a 2-car garage and constantly making messes, I highly recommend that rigid router. I'll put a link down in the description. Again, not affiliate links, not sponsored. I think it's just a really great tool. Now for sanding this chamfer and the sides, I really wanted to be super careful, so I put the speed all the way down on my sander and sanded them very, very carefully, really trying to pay attention to the proportions. Now, it was time to start addressing these two big voids, and this is some pretty cool stuff. This is Total Boat UV cured resin, meaning you can have either that little UV light that I have, or you can set it out in the sun, and that is how this resin cures. And I thought it was just a really, really cool idea. I follow this guy on YouTube called BM Sculptures, and he built a T-Rex skull sculpture out of a piece of old growth redwood, and he used some of this whenever he ran into an issue with a crack. And I just really wanted to try it out because I figured that it probably looks better than CA glue, but doesn't take a whole day to cure like tabletop epoxy. So I went ahead and gave it a shot, and it worked remarkably well. You just have to be kind of careful with how deep you pour it, because this stuff really isn't meant to be poured more than maybe a 1/16 of an inch. But after it had cured, it sanded remarkably well, and it was time to start focusing on some of just the smaller imperfections that you normally deal with whenever you do these wood and epoxy tables. Little bubble holes, little pin holes in the wood and the epoxy. Some you could fix with CA glue, some I decided to fix with this resin. It all worked out just fine in the end either way. From there, it was time to start sanding everything up. But there were a couple of issues after I got down a little bit more with the sanding. There were some other little fine hairline cracks and even some like major holes that were opening up. So what I decided to do is use this Total Boat Thixo. And this stuff is great. It takes about 4 hours to cure totally, but it cures really, really hard, and it fills in these gaps very easily. It's not a liquid, so it doesn't run all over the place, and it just is so much easier to work with. Now, after that had cured and I sanded everything off, it was time to start sanding all the way up to 320 and finishing this thing. Now, the secret to success with that pencil grid is once the pencil grid is gone, and you've sanded it away, don't go back to that area until you go to the next grit. And that's how you keep your piece totally flat and totally even. Now this is the base I chose to use. It's something I got off of Amazon. It was super cheap, like $30. And what I was showing you with that stepping bit is that I had to enlarge the holes. That's it. And I wasn't going to show the process because it's really not that interesting. But what is interesting is the small debate that occurs in the epoxy table world, where some will say it's perfectly acceptable to drill your threaded inserts into the epoxy. Some will say to avoid it at all costs. I'm obviously on the latter side, as you can tell from this shot alone. But Chris at 4 Eyes Furniture did actually have to drill into the epoxy at one point, and he did a test where he smacked a threaded insert into epoxy with a hammer. And it actually held up just fine. But it's still something I would like to avoid because epoxy is plastic, meaning it's malleable, and wood is not. So that's why I prefer to avoid it. Now, as always, I am using Rubio Monocoat, and because these are cookies, it does take a little bit more finish to actually saturate them and get that full amount of protection, but it really wasn't as much as I thought it was going to absorb with these two pieces. Now, something I really tried to pay attention to on this project was my sanding, because I've noticed in a couple of other projects that you can actually still see some of the curlicues, but with this one, I managed to avoid that altogether, and I'm very happy with the finished result. Now, I said at the beginning of this video that when I put out the pictures on Instagram, nobody really hit me up for a commission, but I put these pictures out on Instagram, and yeah, still nobody's buying it. It's still in my garage. It's for $2,000 if you want it, if you're interested in it at all, but I'm just really, really happy with it. So guys, I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you next time.